House rules are unofficial rules that players and dungeon masters incorporate into their home games. Most of the time, these rules are there to enrich the game experience in some way, but sometimes house rules can do just the opposite. Today, we're going to go over 10 of the worst house rules that are fairly common in 5th edition. Starting us off at number 10, we have natural 20s always succeed house rule. Now, in certain cases, this is true in the game. Attack rolls do always succeed on a natural 20, but rules as written, that's not the case for saving throws, skill checks, and ability checks. And with those rolls, natural 20s always succeeding can be a lot more questionable. Saving throws don't cause too much of a problem, as they're mostly confined to combat, and it's rarely impossible to succeed on those saves anyhow. So a natural 20 is normally enough even without implementing a critical success. But it's a lot more suspect with skill and ability checks. Allowing players to always succeed on a 20 can be fun for the players most of the time, as it lets them succeed in otherwise hopeless situations and accomplish something their character typically wouldn't be able to do. That said, it can encourage the negative behavior of every player at the table asking to roll on skill checks in every situation just to succeed through the sheer number of dice being thrown at a problem. The actual worst part of this rather common rule is enemies always succeeding on natural 20s. Throughout a typical campaign, there are going to be more enemies than players by an order of magnitude, which means a dungeon master will end up mirroring that player strategy and throw a ton of dice at every roll. Any enemy succeeding on any check by just getting a lucky 5% chance to roll a d20 can really undermine what the player can do. Imagine a bumbling group of ogres with a -2 to the perception check trying to spot an epic level 20 rogue who's sneaking around. The rogue's lowest possible roll for stealth is a 25, because of their high bonus combined with a reliable talent class feature that means they can't get below a 10 for their d20 rolls. Well, give 20 ogres each a chance to roll a natural 20, and it becomes trivial to completely invalidate the player's investment to develop into becoming a master of stealth. Why should that rogue roll at a 19 and getting a 34 total stealth be spotted by an oblivious enemy who rolls 1 better? This is even more problematic in social scenarios. Social encounters have nearly entirely been defined by skill checks and various spells and abilities that require saving throws. This house rule can make an entire social encounter become undone by an incidental 20 being rolled on an insight check, even if the character in question has bad insight skills against master social manipulators. Letting the player succeed more often isn't so bad, but crushing player versus encounter interaction through sheer numbers completely messes up the way the game is designed to be played. That's why these types of rolls are excluded in the regular rules from automatic natural 20 success, and should usually stay that way. Though admittedly, there are always exceptions. After all, the rule of cool is an excellent example of a great house rule, and the rule of cool is most often invoked on a well-timed natural 20. Just don't make it automatic. And at number 9, we have the house rule that all spellcasters must use listed material components for their spells instead of component pouches or spellcasting focuses. This one is very common, as it was the way spellcasting naturally worked in older editions. There would even be class abilities or feats you could take to avoid having to obtain and keep track of otherwise inconsequential spell materials. In the translation to later editions of the game, this was removed so there would be a lot less bookkeeping to play a spellcaster, which already required the extra bookkeeping of keeping track of your spells in the first place. Now, this isn't inherently a bad house rule. It fits very well in more survival-based games where resource management and scarcity is an integral part to the theme of the setting. Having to keep track of your components and potentially decide what spells to learn because of the difficulty certain components have defined can really benefit the immersion. Where it gets questionable is your more common heroic fantasy games. Oftentimes, dungeon masters will use this house rule as a way to control the spellcasters in the game, rather than think of a workaround to powerful spells. By just denying access to the material components, they can force the player to avoid certain spells or being able to use them at all. But a house rule that exists just to limit or punish players can feel really unfair. That's why just being able to have and use a focus for most of your spells is pretty important to the accessibility of the more complicated spellcaster classes. And removing that for a little to no thematic reason only adds to the frustration and difficulty of the game for the players. It's already just an option for players to use material opponents instead if they want to enrich the role-playing of their spellcasting after all. Players can naturally choose between component pouches, focuses, or acquiring the materials and using them. A dungeon master forcing it on them without good reason for purposes of controlling the players, or for just being used to the older editions, is the more common way this pops up and isn't very healthy for the game. The mechanic still exists with spells that have rare or costly materials, most notably something like Hero's Feast, and these spells are powerful enough to justify the extra bit of investment. Doing it for every spell turns a rare hunt for a powerful material into a chore the spellcaster has to deal with constantly. This rule is something Dungeons & Dragons has mostly done away with, and for pretty good reason. And at number 8, we have forcing party composition. This is another holdover from very early Dungeons & Dragons, along with some hobby crossovers from role-playing video games. The idea is that for a party to succeed, it must have characters who fulfill certain roles is all too common in Dungeons & Dragons space. Now, some of this is actually player imposed. Players who come to a game later or start working on creating their characters later might naturally gravitate to trying to fill in the roles that the other party characters don't fill. And there's nothing wrong with trying to make a cohesive team like that so long as it's the player's choice to do so. Things become more problematic when the Dungeon Master and the other players force certain classes or roles into the party composition. This creates a gatekeeping and first-come, first-served environment to character building instead of natural exploration of the classes and roles that the players feel interested in. There's really nothing inherently wrong with a party with 2 bards, fighters, or multiple classes of anything really. It might seem redundant, but plenty of players have played the same class multiple times and had vastly different roles and experiences with these different characters despite being the same class. The same is true for multiples of the same class in a party. More importantly, forced class stipulation is also often used as a crutch for encounter building. It's easier for a dungeon master to just throw out any encounter based on CR if you have a perfectly balanced party. But a less versatile group might need particular creative encounter design that suits their party. For example, if the party doesn't have a wizard or artificer, then the dungeon master should probably avoid the team needing a specific arcana check to continue on a questline, or at least give them a viable alternative that does suit their capabilities. It's generally a much more enriching experience for the world building to suit the players, as opposed to the players being forced into roles they might not be comfortable or happy with just to fit the idea of a correct party composition. That said, like any rule, there are exceptions. Certain settings might be enriched by things like arcane spellcasting being illegal, so players might need to seek an underground wizard mentor to access the class. A good narrative hook is a bit different from outright banning and is a more elegant way to implement class limitation. And at number 7, we have banning multiclassing. Multiclassing has a tumultuous history in Dungeons & Dragons. Historically, multiclassing was how you would break the game in dozens of different ways. The problem was that, over time, certain editions would add far too many alternative class options that would stack or combine in ways to create some sort of impossibly strong character. So a lot of older school dungeon masters have an understandable aversion to it. And there are some powerful multi-class combinations in 5th edition, but nothing that's truly that game-breaking compared to the horribly broken combinations of something like 3rd edition. Multi-classing shouldn't ever be completely banned because all that does in reality is significantly limit player options. It stops them from exploring new avenues from the character or even trying out new combinations they've heard of that can be fun for the player to explore. Now, on a case-by-case basis, limiting multi-classing options isn't that big of a deal. It's perfectly reasonable for a dungeon master to tell the paladin they can't multi-class into warlock on a whim. Maybe the character has no access to an entity that has the power to grant them warlock abilities, but the player only wants to do it for a powerful class combination and not for any real in-game reason that makes sense for the character. But if that paladin does have a really interesting narrative connection to an entity that might be able to grant them warlock capabilities, why not let them explore that? After all, that lawful good paladin seeking power from a divinely good celestial patron wouldn't be contrary to the character at all, and might be more a direct way they can show their connection to the divine. And that's just one common example where it can be good or bad to allow multiclassing. But the option should always be there, and banning that just because of an inherent and largely outdated version of multiclassing doesn't really do anyone any favors. Although I should add that multiclassing is an optional rule in D&D 5e. So if this one is banned, it's more of a case of not allowing people to use this optional rule and less of a ban. And at number 6, we have hyper-realistic combat house rules. The rule is less about player and dungeon master choice and exploration of the game, and more about how combat works in Dungeons & Dragons. A lot of dungeon masters might try to add some realism to their combats by implementing something like a table for where the body and attack hits, and another table for side effects or being hit in certain spots. Examples including things like getting hit in the arm might impose disadvantage on your next attack that uses the arm, or getting hit in the leg might have your movement speed halved until your next turn. While on a case-by-case basis, putting in some consequences for being hurt can add another layer of depth and interest in combat, the real problem with rules like these is the fact that Dungeons & Dragons combat is already relatively long-winded. Adding multiple extra rolls and tables to the already complicated enough combat system can really bog down gameplay. A fight that might take 1 hour of real time could easily double in length because of house rules like these. Also, making players keep track of multiple disabling status conditions or problems they've occurred by taking damage is begging for mistakes to be made, and many of these to be forgotten throughout the course of a fight. This is why 5th edition lumped all floating bonuses into the advantage and disadvantage system, so as to streamline negative statuses and buffs compared to previous editions. This kind of simulated realistic combat exists in other role-playing systems where hyper-realistic combat is the entire purpose of the game, which is why it's commonly adapted to some Dungeons & Dragons tables. A dungeon master with experience in those other games might have liked it there, and is trying to get the same positive feeling in their own D&D game. But those systems and games are made with those rules in mind, and just stapling them into Dungeons & Dragons is often more clunky than just playing the other systems in the first place. And at number 5, we have allowing all third-party D&D content. Now, third-party content isn't inherently bad. Some third-party content eventually becomes just regular content. A recent example of this is Matthew Mercer's Exandria third-party content that has made the transition to be an official Wizards product. But Matthew Mercer is one of the most popular figures in the hobby, and his third-party content designs have more player testers available to try them out than even Wizards of the Coast do. So he gets a lot more feedback on balancing problems than your average third-party developer will. Most third-party content doesn't get nearly enough playtesting, and even those that do are often incentivized to make overpowered content to attract power gamers who are interested in that sort of thing. A blanket allowance of third-party content turns the game less into building a character to suit a story or narrative or interesting idea, and more into a game about who's the best at googling the most powerful third-party content to squeeze into a game so they don't feel useless. Being drawn to making mechanically optimal characters isn't inherently bad or wrong in Dungeons & Dragons. After all, there's nothing that stops an optimal character from being roleplayed to their best compared to an unoptimized character. But when the power difference between characters becomes too vast, the game can devolve into a minority of the characters solving all the problems, leaving the others out of it. A dungeon master not vetting third-party content invites this schism into the group, and it's rarely for the best. You should never really allow just any third-party content unless you're 100% sure your players have a good eye for avoiding stuff that's too powerful or absurd. And at number 4, we have starting over from level 1 when a character dies. Character death is a part of Dungeons & Dragons, and for some dungeon masters, a long-standing house rule is that when you start a new character, no matter what, you start over from level 1. This is a holdover from 1st edition, where players would often have multiple characters and there wasn't a huge difference between a level 2 or level 1 character. Both were probably going to die anyhow. As the game has grown, character progression has gotten more intricate and important to how you play the game. Not to mention, lethality is largely concentrated at low levels instead of the game constantly being lethal like it was in its earliest editions. This can lead to a player having a sort of death spiral as a level 1 character struggles to stay alive in challenges designed for their higher level party members. And also for the party to struggle a bit by trying to pick up the slack of an underpowered level 1 character. The goal of a rule like this is to maintain a sense of progression for characters, and maybe to avoid things like having this random person who's as powerful as your leveled up party members appearing out of nowhere. This can break immersion to a degree, but protecting that immersion is rarely worth the consequences of forcing a player who already suffered the loss of a character to endure a lot more hardship for wanting to keep playing the game. There is some fun to be had with a party that has disproportionate levels and capabilities though. Earlier editions of the game had different character classes level up at different rates as sort of a balance mechanic to curb how powerful spellcasters eventually become compared to their martial allies, for instance. But as of 5th edition, a lot of those power differences have been smoothed over, and the game is largely designed around a party of the same level characters all working together, thus making the start over at level 1 rule obsolete outside of the most obscure circumstances. And on the same note, and at number 3, we have custom experience systems. Now, these aren't always so bad. There can be a lot of interesting and cool ways for a dungeon master to play with how the characters level up, even if they level asymmetrically based on achieving certain goals or having certain defining character moments. A lot of role-playing games have this as a core mechanic, but as mentioned previously, D&D is largely balanced around a same-level party. Implementing old or new style rules that will inevitably lead to the characters drifting apart in levels requires a lot of extra bookkeeping for the players, as well as an entirely new dimension of encounter design balance for the dungeon master to worry about. Even something as simple as a single level difference can cause a cascade of effects that are unfair to certain players. One player having access to their second attack before another on a martial class can lead to the party putting all of their best gear onto that stronger player to maximize efficiency. After all, the magic sword is going to be a lot more effective in the hands of a level 5 paladin instead of the level 4 fighter. This can widen the already large gap in how effective the characters are in their primary roles. A better solution to wanting to mess with the level system in Dungeons & Dragons is to make sure that leveling up is tied to all characters so they level at the same time. Do you want the characters to level when they achieve an important personal goal? Well, make it so they only level when every member of the party has achieved a goal, so they're more likely to work together and help each other out. Or level them all up at the same time when one person achieves a big goal and categorize it as a group effort. There are good ways to do custom leveling and experience systems, but some of the worst house rules are the ones that split the players up in who gets to level and who doesn't. And it can become an even bigger problem if the dungeon master ends up playing favorites, doling out more experience with the players and characters they like best. Any house rule that promotes favoritism is always questionable. And at number 2, we have permanent injuries. Permanent injuries are a fairly common house rule meant to simulate what would really happen to a person if, say, a giant crocodile bit their leg but didn't kill them. It usually seeks to bypass the natural hidden mechanics of the game, not messing with hit points but imposing permanent downsides. Very commonly, these permanent injuries will be tied to certain mechanics triggering them, like a player losing half their hit points or more to a single attack or critical hit tables that come with permanent injuries. The latter is especially rough because players can't really avoid being hit with a critical roll every now and then. They already have to suffer increased damage, but a risk of some permanently debilitating injury is unfair because these will only really affect the players. Enemies don't tend to stick around long enough for permanent injury systems to affect them very much, but player characters are in the game for the long haul. Doubly so when the specific injuries can be catastrophic based on a class. A broken jaw might not be a big deal for Barbarian to suffer, but if it prevents the wizard from casting spells, suddenly they're useless. A crippled hand is something a spellcaster might be able to deal with, but the two-handed weapon using fighter is going to have to rethink their entire character to function properly for it. While these decisions on their own, in isolated incidents, can be interesting or worth exploring in a game, automating it to happen randomly and arbitrarily creates an unhealthy environment for the players. A more reasonable house rule to achieve the more positive aspects of permanent injuries is giving a player permanent injury as a narrative consequence for a decision. This is a much stronger way to go about implementing this kind of obstacle for players rather than leaving it purely up to luck. And it lets you control it so it's not too unfair or arbitrary, so you can make sure the players are still able to have fun. Automating extra failure for players outside of the game's regular failure mechanics can make for some of the most unfun situations, which leads to the last house rule on this list. And at number 1, we have critical fumbles. Critical fumbles are maybe the most common house rule in the game. They're designed to add a bit more spice to the player's worst rolls, emulating the highs of critical hit successes by giving an even bigger lower to a critical failure. Common critical fumbles include things like making players accidentally hit each other with their attacks, somehow bypassing each other's armor class when they catastrophically fail, or hurting their allies. Sometimes more extreme things like the player who rolled a natural 1 losing or even breaking their weapon. Or failure on a persuasion check that can turn a previously neutral or friendly NPC hostile, escalating a situation just because the player was trying to engage in a social encounter. The problem with this kind of rule is that players are disproportionately affected by this compared to non-player characters. Much like the previously mentioned permanent injury table, players are inevitably going to roll 1s throughout the course of a game and are going to have to survive with any critical fumble consequences for the foreseeable future. An enemy critically fumbling isn't that big of a deal. There's always new enemies around the corner. Increasing the likelihood of terrible outcomes in the game just means the player will end up suffering more negative outcomes, and are more likely to suffer a full team party kill or a completely failed objective for something entirely out of their control that isn't really a part of the game. Rolling a 1 is already bad enough. The majority of the time it's already a failure, and a failure doesn't need a bigger downside. It's not like critical hits where a small increase in damage might be helpful, but damage variants already exist, and critical hit damage is already factored into the bounds of the game. The occasional narrative flair to add to the consequences of a failure is well within the bounds of the rules and can add a lot of spice to the game. But systematically making rolling 1s an even more ruinous outcome just encourages player to not try to do anything that requires a roll, for fear of bigger consequences that they can't predict. Failure is an important part of the game, but you should try to avoid anything that might make the players averse to playing the game for fear of failure. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other house rules you've experienced that were as bad or worse than these? Do you have any ideas for future topics you'd like me to cover? If so, leave those thoughts down below in the comments, and thanks for watching.